I don't know. I don't want to like go into sociology on this kind of stuff, but I think about this stuff a lot. I love it.
I think they would love it if you went into because part of what every Hello, Ryan Denney.
Hey, Ryan.
I'll let you like maybe introduce the topic.
Sure. I would say we were just talking about kind of your upcoming schedule for these meetups and your podcast, and kind of thinking about some of the technical aspects of integration architecture. This will not be that. This is more of kind of a philosophy behind the why, and less about the technical nuts and bolts of the how. More kind of the people side of things and the business side of things a little bit. Yeah, kind of just like a philosophy of integration in general. So.
Yeah, and you worded it as like the inverse, like it's a recovery process. That I guess Gregor Hope's book always puts enterprise in front of it, right? Where
Yeah.
enterprise integration, and I suppose that's what MuleSoft is for anyway. So probably appropriate in the MuleSoft meetup to focus on that. Although integration is not only for business, I suppose.
No, definitely not. It's something that, you and I have worked together in this area for lots of years now. And one of the things I've learned over the years is just how much my work life, like the things that I've learned as a solution architect, just thinking about integration in general, how much that bleeds over into my life. Just the need to be like well integrated as a person and as a dad and a husband and all those things. So yeah, there's a lot of just kind of lessons to draw out from that, and things that we can then like turn back around into the work and help companies to integrate better. Because I think, like you said, sort of the inverse of that, or thinking about disintegration, I just tend to think that's kind of the natural state. Like things tend toward entropy, not to get into thermodynamics, but yeah, that's how things tend to go. They tend to break down, either moving toward chaos or rigidity, or both, I would say. And so yeah, trying to integrate not just software but people as well is. So you mentioned Gregor and his enterprise integration patterns book. There's another book that he wrote. I think it came out in 2021. It's the Software Architect Elevator. Are you familiar with that book?
Yeah, but it's the stack on my nightstand, so I haven't opened it yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's good. I like that sort of as a metaphor. One of the things he talks about, that metaphor of the elevator in a corporate office building, like he talks about the engine room, basically the basement, is where the developers live and work and do their thing to drive the company from a technology perspective. And the senior leadership's up in the penthouse, and we need to be able to ride the elevator. And as sort of solution architects, enterprise architects, whatever kind of role you have in that vein, being able to communicate effectively with people throughout the organization, like trying to get your finger on the pulse of what it is the business is trying to do. And that, for me as an architect, as when we were younger, starting out, I kind of lost the plot on that early on. It was hard for me to get a feel for the business side of things. I always kind of took the approach that this is a technical problem and that we need to solve this technical problem. And if we can do that, everything will be fine. And it just hasn't worked. It doesn't work that way. Right? There's a lot of people involved, and we're talking about change. I think that's an important thing to consider.
Why are we talking about change?
Well, because I think what MuleSoft is inherently about is very much a change process. It's about initiating change within a company for better integrating the software for the needs of the business.
I think we should take the emperor's clothes off, because MuleSoft talks about the integration is one of those words like continuous integration, integration testing, enterprise integration. It shows up all over the place.
Yeah.
And we all just act like we know what it means. You want to maybe take a shot at like making a layman's terms, like take that word. Why are we integrating things?
One of the core needs of companies is, well, I guess the underlying reality for companies is they have lots of different pieces of software. Right? And that software needs to work holistically to some degree. Otherwise, you end up with a bunch of siloed off business units and siloed off information. And it just makes it difficult to run the business effectively. And we've all experienced that. Right? You call into an airline, for instance, and try to change your flight or something, and you're on the phone or on their chat bot anymore, but it's hard to it's hard to get to a person that can really help you because they don't really have a holistic look into the details a lot of times. And that's changed to some degree over the years, but I think that there's still like this core underlying problem of making systems work holistically, and which is hard because we just kind of tack on more and more software, more packaged software, more kind of bespoke functions to different pieces of internal software, and it's all different. Right? Everyone's coming at it from a different perspective, from a different sort of business need, and we just end up with a bunch of stuff, and we need to make it work more holistically together. And so that's what I mean. That's what I think of when I think of enterprise integration.
And MuleSoft was obviously better, and we can get to that history part soon. I thought of what you just said, like as if when you say the word system, you mean a computer program running on the network or something. And I'm sure you do mean that, but you don't only mean that. Like the systems are more than just that.
That's a very good point. I think it's not just a packaged software system. It's internal systems as well, and like ways of communicating amongst people and how things operate internally. It's like making all of that work better and more in a state of flow, I guess, rather than, like I said earlier, kind of chaos or rigidity.
And what are some practical actions? Like that might sound a little overwhelming for a developer becoming an architect. Like how on earth do they do anything about making the people and the business processes and the computers work better together?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and it's kind of a lifelong journey, in my opinion. It's not like you're ever going to solve it. There is no end point. It's more of a direction. And in my opinion, this is where kind of the philosophy of it comes in. In my opinion, it's partly just about who you are as a person and who are you becoming, and like how can we as human beings working in companies, regardless of our role, be better at communicating effectively, like trying to understand. I mean, empathetically, I guess, is a way of framing it. Like having, actually, I'll say one of my favorite lines from Bertrand Russell is like the introduction to one of his books. He talks about reading philosophy with a sympathetic imagination, like sympathetically trying to understand the perspective of another person. And I don't think we do that very well. We tend to focus on, well, depending on who we are, like what our role is in a company, tend to focus either on share price, or we tend to focus on getting the next sprint done on time, like getting the tasks done in the sprint in the next 2 weeks. And we kind of tend to lose focus on the bigger picture, which to me is kind of a leadership problem in a lot of companies. Like setting a vision and getting everyone aligned with that vision is not exactly the role of a technical architect. Not at all, actually. But we can understand it ourselves and try to work with the senior leadership to understand that well, with that sort of sympathetic imagination or kind of empathetic view of it. And then try to translate that and help people throughout the organization, developers, other architects, middle management, and so on, whoever it is, really try to align with that in a way that will move the needle, not in the short term, but probably in a more long-term way. Yeah. And that, I think, is the hard part of it. There is no one answer. It's more just like a way of being and a direction, and it's difficult to measure. So yeah, there's a lot in there, I think.
But there's practical. I can relate to kind of the process you're talking about going through as like a way I do my work during the day. Like I open up, or I walk into the office if it's in person, or I open up my laptop in the morning if it's remote. And what am I going to do now? I'm going to read an email. I'm going to chat with somebody on Teams. I'm going to fill out a Jira ticket. I'm going to write a document. I'm going to build some code. I have to select from all of the options of things I can do. And it sounds like what you're suggesting is like there's a discovery that has to happen of what are they up to, and what is the challenge this other person ran into, and what is the change in the market that the business is dealing with this week. It sounds like there's like you don't already know in the morning today's plan.
Yeah, I would say, I guess I could see that on a day-to-day basis. I guess I'm thinking more like longer periods of time where you kind of check back in with like the why. Like, why are we doing this? What's the direction here? Is it really in line with where we're trying to head as a company? Does this make sense? Like, does this way of communicating, or like, does this build process make sense? Where can we improve this? And why, really? So maybe quarterly or monthly or something like that, check in. Yeah, I could see. I don't necessarily have a schedule as far as how often I do that. I think I just go more with my gut. Mm-hmm. But that's just kind of how I'm wired. Yeah. But I could see for someone in practical terms to say, like, here's my daily process. I mean, I don't want to make it all like mystical sounding or like too philosophical, but like there's an approach to mindfulness, I think, that translates very effective or very well into not just business, but any area of life.
Yeah.
So just being like self-aware on a daily basis, checking in with yourself, and then maybe more periodically having kind of those bigger picture check-ins, so to speak.
Yeah, and in a social unit, whether it's a family or a business or a MuleSoft community meetup group, there's a version of that happens between people where we check in that we are on track, you know, and that what our goals are still the ones we want to have, right? But do you think there's a place for ceremony in that, or ritual, or even more like, I don't know how rigid. I want to, architects build diagrams and make standards, and there's ways that we formalize the way we work. And I wonder what place you think that has in discovering whether our goals are right or not right, or changing them.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess I really haven't given that too much thought, to be honest with you. I could see some development of some sort of ceremony, some sort of ways of checking in that could be helpful.
You and I both, one thing we have in common, we don't get to compare notes about it very often. We both teach architecture classes, and they're not our classes, they're Salesforce's curriculum, but we kind of make them our own because you can't just teach. There's no way to just follow the curriculum. People try it, but it doesn't make sense if you do that. So I have come up with some ceremonies, social ceremonies, like at the beginning of the Monday morning of a 5-day class, I find out what everybody's job is and what they've done with MuleSoft before and what they would hope to get out of the week. And then I write it on a document and I share it on a Google Drive. And then I check in on Wednesday and I check in on Friday morning back to the document against what we've done together. So there's a way to kind of use a little bit of formalism as a container for the dynamic discovery process. It doesn't force it to be too rigid, but it gives it like a structure.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, actually. People sort of then align toward that, and you're have this shared focus on what are individual goals, and then what are goals of the team as a whole. It's hard to form a team in that week of an architecture class, but I see what you're saying. I could see that totally translating into like a Scrum team or something like that.
Yeah, groups that live longer. I have a note here that you pointed out something more about the group of people. Maybe we can go to that. There's people in the enterprise, and then there's technology in the enterprise, and you were kind of getting at that it would be valuable if more of those people could get to more of the things that the enterprise can do. You want to go that way?
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me think about how I want to frame this. I'll just hang it off of this frame. This is more of like my personal life philosophy. I tend to I don't draw real hard lines between different areas of my life. I think just in terms of how I think, it just bleeds over into all the areas of my life. So this is kind of a framework I'm still playing around with in my mind, but I've been developing it for years now. And the idea is that I just think human beings fundamentally have sort of three ways of looking at the world that are tightly interrelated. You can't really pull them apart, but kind of three levels of meaning, so to speak. One would be like the big picture, almost like metaphysical meaning of the world, meaning of the universe type stuff. And then there's a lower level, which is like group dynamics, and like from family to community to work to nation, all those sort of collective stories, so to speak. I think in our culture, in America at least, we tend to focus. If we kind of zoom in now to particular company context, the big picture, almost like metaphysical sense of meaning, is often pretty ill-defined. I think for publicly traded companies, it's usually just how can we create shareholder value. That's not terribly motivating to most people, in my experience.
Number go up.
That's right. So if that's like the big picture frame that you're working in, I think that's where I think senior leadership really has a responsibility, and like for their own good and for the good of the company, to paint a better picture than that, like to put a better vision in place and to make sure people are aligned with that.
Well, there was an author you mentioned to me who you've really enjoyed his view of leadership. John Cotter, do you want to go that way with it?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, so this goes hand in hand, I think, with the idea of the Center for Enablement, which I think is like a really good model for trying to drive change within an organization. It's very much in line with what I was just talking about. That was kind of my personal spin on it. But
yeah,
the idea with that book, John Cotter's book, it's called Leading Change, and he's got this model that is pretty similar to the ideas in the C4E, the idea of catalyst. That's what it's more aligned with, is catalyst. So catalyst is about trying to understand the goals of the company. That's the where are we headed, like the big picture vision. And then how do we get there in terms of technology and people is one way to frame that. So in catalyst, it's like technology delivery, which breaks down into two pieces, right? And then organizational enablement. And I always just say that's the people side of things. That's the part that, as a technical architect, as a developer, is not always apparent. Like there's not a lot of training in that. And that's the part I was saying earlier is kind of the thing I've had to learn more about. Like how do we, as humans, kind of collaborate and foster communication and all those sorts of things. Well, Cotter's model is, excuse me. Yeah, it's very much aligned with that. The idea being that change is hard. And so let's set a vision and then put a team together to drive that vision forward, and then execute on some things to try and get some short-term wins, so to speak. And then enable by removing barriers throughout the organization. Barriers come up in all sorts of ways, right? From technical blockers to interpersonal communication stuff to lack of alignment with broader vision, all those sorts of things. With the idea being that it hopefully will then, as you kind of prove it out and get a process in place, would become, it would take over. It's kind of in line with like Atomic Habits way of looking at things. Like, let's do one small thing and do it well, and like kind of master that entry point, so to speak. That's the way James Clear talks about it in his book. Hopefully that will then just kind of become the habit of the company, or it'll become the way it'll institutionalize or install the change, so to speak, in the organization. Which all sounds very abstract, I think, but it's that's why I said this is, in my opinion, some of the philosophy behind why we're talking about this is important to get in mind.
Well, so MuleSoft, I really like where you're going with that. That you kind of tied it back to Catalyst, but you see Catalyst almost like it's a very important part of doing MuleSoft architecture in your mind. And I don't know that everybody, I think a lot of people kind of sort of vaguely know that it's a website, and that's about as much as it has to do with their job. So right. maybe you can give them a little reason that they might spend their time and effort on it.
Sure. Well, I think you and I both started in the same place, right? We're Java developers and we're doing integration. I mean, I didn't even know I was doing integration. I wouldn't have called it that at the time. I was just writing code, and whatever task came my way, I'm like, okay, I got to take this field and transform it and push it into this DB2 instance or whatever.
Oh,
yeah, I'm going to read this EDI doc and whatever. And then MuleSoft came around, or not MuleSoft, but Mule, the little open source ESB. And like you said, it was better. Like, it was easier. I don't have to open a database connection and remember to close it when I'm done. That's like the idea of a connector was helpful. Right? And it kind of wrapped up even Spring in some ways for us, or leveraged that in a way that was really powerful. And then it became a really commonly used tool for SOA implementations. And that's where we started working together, right? Working with companies doing their SOA implementations. Well, looking back on that, I think our job was essentially running triage on SOA implementations that weren't going very well. And yeah, like we just would drop into a company and be like, what's going on? And it was like, well, we don't know. There's a lot of chaos here. And they would never say it quite like that, but I think we both started to see that, right? It's just kind of, and then we're just kind of making it up as we go. We're reading books and like, well, let's try this. A platform built around it, which they didn't have at the time, right? It was just Mule and Mule Monitoring Center, right? MMC.
Yeah.
Or Mule Management Console, right?
Management Console, yeah.
That's right. But there was no process, right? There was, like, for our company, we tried to do our thing our way. Mm-hmm. We were trying to build that. But every company was doing things their way. And we'd try to go in and change the culture of a company from the bottom up, essentially. And it just, like, that didn't work either. And so I think the value of Catalyst is that it does start with vision casting. And it's not MuleSoft trying to inject their vision on the company that they're working with, on the customer. It's really more that sort of sympathetic imagining and hearing of the company. Like, what do you want to do? What is the point here? What are we doing? Where are we headed? And if that doesn't then translate down and filter through all the rest of the integration work, then something's off. Right? If that vision's being missed, that's very problematic. And that's where I think the sort of the genius of Catalyst comes in. Like, let's understand the business outcomes first and then align everything else with that. How do we get there in terms of technology and people? And the people part of it is, I think, also the other part that gets missed a lot of times. We tend to focus just on the code, just on the technology, which is not unimportant, obviously, but it's only one part of it.
It reminds me of there's a guy, he's still on the internet, and I would love to have him on this meetup. His name's Mel Conway. But he wrote a law in the 60s or 70s or something, Conway's Law, that's named after him. I don't know if he named it that himself, or I don't know how that works. How are you going to get Denney's Law named Denney's Law? That
I
would
don't
be
want a law. I don't.
that would be cool, though, right? No, I guess not. You don't want one.
How about Denny's aphorism or something like
that? but anyway, he observed that this technology and the software tends to mirror. Now, it's a lot more technically worded nowadays. It's 50 years old. That's what happened. But the software and the people, the way the people talk to each other and work together gets. So like if you have if you have 5 teams working on a compiler, you're going to end up with a 5-stage compiler, right? Not because that's the best way to build a compiler,
right?
Because you had 5 teams working on it. So that's the way the software ends up. And I think MuleSoft is also very, like that's what I like about API led is we kind of, okay, you got 10 systems, so you got 10 system APIs. Makes sense, right? So it sounds like what you're kind of saying about Catalyst is like you can't just ignore how the people work,
right?
And just try to make some code because that's not going to be the right code.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's interesting you bring up Conway's Law. I haven't thought of that in a while. But actually, I always think of you when I think of Conway's Law because we've had this conversation a bunch of times. But it's just rings true in my experience. Like I don't know that it's a law, but it seems more like a principle of organization.
We should have him and you on here arguing about it. That'd be great. Is it a law? No, but I mean, it's like you're pointing. I guess what you're pointing out, I hadn't thought of it that way yet. That the Catalyst has 3 whole playbooks for the people part. It's only 6 playbooks, and half the playbook.
It's the people.
It's the people.
And I would say the top one, the business outcomes, is the people also. Like that's just different people. But part of the problem, and this, like, to bring it back to that software architect elevator metaphor, this is where the role of a solution architect, an integration architect, again, whatever kind of title you have or however you want to frame that, can be really valuable in a company to be able to bridge the gap or to ride the elevator up and down and to be able to understand the objectives of the company on their terms without having to make it technical or anything like that, but to understand it on their terms and then to translate that into language that development teams can get on board with. Not that developers can't understand it themselves. They certainly can. But to be able to act as that sort of communication mechanism back and forth, that sort of the conduit, so to speak, for effective understanding, both not just top down, but also sort of bottom up, which is kind of an interesting way to say that. But making sure that you're addressing the concerns of the development teams and others in the company as well, and trying to advocate for effective sort of management for those sorts of pain points or whatever kind of comes up there. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. There's that elevator thing. I think I'm gonna have to move it up my nightstand stack and read that one because I just bought his book Platform Strategy, and so that's what I was gonna read next. But I'll wait on. Maybe I should do the elevator first. The thing that occurred to me when you were saying that is, first of all, like the development teams, it's easy to think, oh, they're just gonna be there, and naturally you can bring them work. But where do the teams come from? Somebody has to decide that we're going to have a development team, or 2 of them, or 5 of them, or expand the team, or shrink the team, or bring in a vendor. So they're going to make leadership decisions on what the team is without having a team in the first place. It has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
So that's going to require discussions with leadership. And then once you have a team, the vision might be a little off. So you need the real life experience that the team is going through so that information is available to the leaders who maybe they need to adjust the vision, right? And how are they going to know that without real input from people who are on the ground doing work? So there's got to be that 2-way information flow.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting if you like play with that metaphor a little longer and take it a little farther. I still think a lot of companies operate in sort of a mechanistic worldview. where it's just sort of an inorganic machine that is seen as doing work to make money. That's not a very great model in my mind. It just doesn't really work that way. It's human beings working together to try and build something. So it's much more organic in the way that you're describing. Um, I don't know. It makes me think of, like, when I said top down, bottom up, immediately that makes me think of neuroscience and like the way our cognitive functioning works. Not that I'm a neuroscientist. I mean, I can only scratch the surface of that, but like that top down processing, like through the neocortex, like, are we thinking our way into this solution, or are we like emoting our way? That would be more like the bottom up way of processing. And that obviously breaks down really quickly in terms of like developers at the bottom and executives at the top. But there is some truth, I think, or something to be gleaned from the idea that neither one's better than the other, right? They're both necessary. Right? Bottom up processing in your central nervous system is extremely important.
Yeah. You're kind of showing there's a talent that I think I think it starts as a talent, but it's a skill, and you can practice it over many years of being able to hold loose abstractions loosely and make use of them. So like this neuroscience abstraction, it's not perfect, but it's useful. Right? And you can kind of not get too stuck on the fact that it's not a perfect match and still get the value of like the senses, like touch and sight. Like your systems have senses and they get information from the world, whether it's like CRM events or RabbitMQ events or IoT sensors. That's like touch and smell and so you could kind of use that analogy and then not get too stuck. Like when it stops working, you don't use it. You switch to a different analogy. I think architects have that skill.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, some of the best architects I've worked with are able to do that. It's something that I've worked hard on in my career, just to try and be able to communicate with people better. So I've had to think in metaphors a lot. I mean, that's just how my mind tends to work anyway, but I've tried to learn how to use that to communicate with people. So when I teach that, especially the platform architecture course, one of the points I try to make early on when we're defining terms is I ask people what they mean by API. Like, define it for me. What does it mean when you say API? And you get lots of different answers. And it makes sense because it's a really overloaded term these days. And MuleSoft means by it a REST API or REST-ish. And I try not to go down that rabbit hole, like arguing about what is not RESTful. But the point I'm always trying to get to with people is that as a platform architect, part of the role is to be able to help communicate the vision and the strategy, not just to developers, but to everyone in the organization that you're interacting with. And that's a hard thing to be able to do sometimes, because you need to like have that argument with, or maybe not argument, but you have to have that discussion about what is or is not RESTful with some developers who might be sticklers for it. And they're not wrong. Right? There's some valid points there for sure. But you also might need to sit down with a product owner or someone in the business that really doesn't have a good concept for what an API is. And that's where having some metaphors available is really helpful, or can be very helpful.
Sure. If you're going to ask them to spend more money, like, hey, you could just go use Zapier and zap your data around. But no. Let's take 6 weeks or 12 weeks and let's build these expensive APIs instead. They are going to legitimately want to know why you're going to spend all that money.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Yeah, so you got to be able to. So have you found, what kind of metaphors come to mind?
Well, the two that I think are most useful, and I always think of someone like my dad or something, like someone who's an intelligent person, but he's not really like a tech guy. He doesn't know what an API is. And if I were going to describe to him what an API is and its value, the one I like the best is the restaurant analogy. MuleSoft's always used the analogy, or like used the waiter, the server, as the API example. I don't love that. I would take that a step farther. But the idea that it's very concrete example, but you sit down like you're the diner, and there's a menu that you get, and then there's a waiter, there's the kitchen staff, and then there's the food itself. And the API in that scenario is not the waiter, it's the menu. The API doesn't really do anything except explain what's available in terms that you can understand. And that's, if that's not, well, I shouldn't say that's not doing anything. It doesn't do any like physical work or anything, but it's extremely important, right? Like if you're like, I went to a restaurant last night with my family and ordered like the number 18 or something. Like, well, that doesn't have any meaning except in some specific context. So the menu in that case tells me what it is and how can I order it and what are the modifiers and all those sorts of things. And so that's one I use pretty often with people, just as a way of kind of describing the value of an interface.
Yeah, I was at a that really clicks for me too, because I think it leads to a place we wanted to go with this discussion. So I'm going to try to get there, but I wanted to contrast like the number 18. What's the number 18? Just real quick. What is it?
It was some pizza. It just had a bunch of different.
Yeah. It was a pizza and it had a bunch of different toppings, and you knew it didn't have anchovies, and
exactly,
which was kind of important because nobody likes anchovies, right? Everybody. I don't know, but there's like a number 5,000 that has anchovies. So I was on a vacation with my wife in Guatemala, and there was a number of restaurants that are pretty usual that you go to. Like they have a menu if you ask for one because you're an American and you always are used to having menus, but that's not what they cook anyway. Like you go in there and you just get desayuno, which is breakfast, and then they ask you if you want some eggs and what kind of eggs, and you answer their questions. And there's a lot of back and forth, like negotiating what you're going to eat, which is a very personable, homey experience. But you only get like 2 or 3 couples that can eat like that because you're kind of in somebody's. Because there they have like the kitchen in the back, and it's like their house upstairs, like a few tables in the front, and that's the restaurant. So like you're not going to have a number 18. Right, that's not a thing. Like that's so the experience in enterprises with software is a lot like that.
Yeah,
where you go, I want to get some data from the data warehouse. Oh, okay, what kind of data do you want? Some desayuno. Do you want to have it in JSON? You want to have it in Excel spreadsheets? I got a file server over here, and they go.
Yeah, that's a really good example, I think. Yeah, I like that. So then every sort of integration package, every project you're working on is like that ordering of the breakfast. We're gonna
and then after you go back and forth, and then with software it's worse because they don't actually have bacon, so then they have to go to the store and get you bacon, and your project takes 6 months.
Yeah.
And then
develop some new synthetic bacon as well.
Yeah, or they give you synthetic bacon. You're like, this is not what I ordered, but you didn't order because there's no order because there's no API.
Yeah, that's a good extension of that. I think it's like the anti-pattern.
It's a fun metaphor, but I guess I wanted to take that like negotiation process. You can imagine how an enterprise is if every time you want the technology to do something, that's what it's like. You're going to have a few experts who are really good at negotiating requirements, and then you're going to call them the VP of business analysts and analysis and let them hire a team of BAs, and because that's the wrong answer according to MuleSoft, right? Like one way to navigate getting enterprise technology is to have a giant PMO and a whole bunch of business analysts who are really good at negotiating with the desayuno lady about breakfast.
Yeah.
But MuleSoft has a different idea. You want to maybe there's like this API composable enterprise thing. How is that better? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think that's really fundamental. That's been MuleSoft's vision for as long as I can remember. Like I said, we started doing this with service-oriented architecture, and that was the same idea. But the idea really is let's put an interface, like a nice clean layer of abstraction that gives you the number 18 from SAP or from Salesforce or whatever it is. so that everything else can then communicate on those terms. And that's the idea of the process layer. So the system layer is that clean layer of abstraction that defines terms well, makes it simpler to interact with a given backend system, and then those become, in MuleSoft's sort of Lego brick metaphor, the composable enterprise, those system APIs and even process APIs as well become sort of those recomposable bricks that you can build new stuff with. You can design those or put them together in various ways because they're all sort of standardized, just like Lego bricks or whatever. I don't think they say Lego, probably because of copyright, but
This is a meetup. We're fine.
that's right.
I'll take responsibility, everybody.
Okay.
Send me the lawsuit.
Sorry, Lego.
I probably spent enough on Legos that they've gotten their money's worth for you to use the term. I have an R2D2 in my house.
Yeah.
So, and you have got a point about it. You have got a story that I think the world needs to hear about the composable enterprise, like, because it sounds almost like a contradiction in my mind, and I'd like you to resolve it because I don't think it's a contradiction. That I've got this composable enterprise that gives everybody the freedom to use all the technology however they want, right? Easily, without having to order breakfast for an hour, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's one way of looking. But then you also have this emphasis on leadership and establishing a vision and the Center for Enablement and all of the projects working together. So I almost see like the Rebel Alliance and the Imperial Senate, both. I don't know if you get that metaphor, everybody, but maybe Ryan does. So how do you resolve that?
Well, I think the way I look at it is like what we just said about the composable enterprise and API-led connectivity. And so that's like the utopian vision of enterprise integration. Mm-hmm. But getting there is not easy, right? It's hard to do. And so I talk a lot about the principles of API-led connectivity all the time when we just kind of think about best practices at the different layers and how to do it. But where it breaks down is with the people side of things. And a big part of that is because of the lack of alignment with the vision. And oftentimes, in my experience, I think you would agree with this too, that the goal ends up not being anything related to composability or long-term integration. It's very much short-term. Let's get this new widget out the door, or let's tack on this feature, or whatever it is, or let's get this data from here to there. And so we build an ETL job essentially with Mule or whatever other middleware you have. And so I don't see it as two opposing camps. I don't see it as like the Rebel Alliance and the Sith Lord or whatever. It's more, it's just people in a company. And we have sort of competing visions a lot of times. And I think maybe the bigger tension is between the short-term versus the long-term thinking. So yeah, I guess kind of the philosophy there and the like that utopian vision and then the sort of people side of things are, I guess you could frame it as one's like, here's the nice clean story about it, but then in practice, it's very hard to pull off and requires a lot of people to communicate effectively and have a different sort of time frame in mind almost.
Can you help all the people listening to this do the responsible thing with short-term versus long-term?
Oh man, that's such a hard thing to do. That is the crux of it. There are no easy answers in this field, in my opinion. It's like, I don't know, a lot of times when I'm teaching that architecture course, it feels like people are just looking for the answer. And there isn't one. There is no answer. It's a process. It's a way of really negotiating a bunch of trade-offs. And that's really all it comes down to. Like, from a technical perspective and from a business and kind of short-term versus long-term perspective, how can we make decisions with the information that we have at the time that best aligns with where we want to go? And so I don't know that I have an answer for that question. It's more,
you've shared some answers with me in private conversations before, because it's not just about technology jobs. It is, like you said, the lines in your life are gray, You're
Yeah.
an architect, but you're not just an architect. You're a dad, you're a man, you're a citizen, you're all these things. And in your real life, you find yourself in short-term versus long-term decisions. Am I going to replace that hot water heater with the cheap or just fix the part for $300? Like, so you that there is like you're saying, I can't give my son he's 25. I can't give him the answer key to when to replace the hot water heater or when to replace the car and get a new, like, he has to come, but I can give him some principles. I can give him some kind of like decision, like, here's how you think about short-term versus long-term in your life. And I think, those of us in this meeting are kind of very lucky, but also very humbly responsible for very high dollar decisions for our companies.
Yeah.
Where if we make the wrong short-term versus long-term decision, it could be dozens of jobs, or it could be a whole bunch of people's medical records. Like, the consequences are not good if we mess up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Both of those points. One is that, like, just living by principles and having almost like a heuristic for making those sorts of decisions, and then also taking seriously the responsibility that we have to make decisions that, not just for the bottom line, although that's not unimportant for companies, but also like for the well-being of people's data and sometimes actual, like, physical realities in the world. Usually we're not building a bridge where it could fall in the river, but we're often dealing with financial data or medical records, that sort of stuff. There's like serious ramifications if we're not doing that responsibly and doing it well. I guess in my mind, the sort of beginning of that heuristic is just like, who do I want to be in the world? And kind of translating that out, kind of back to that sort of 3-tiered way of looking at life. Like, who do I want to be? And then what does that mean for the team and the company and all those sort of bigger kind of communal relationships? And then how does that align with the bigger vision of my life and of the company and so on? I'm kind of mixing metaphors.
It's working for me, man. Like, who do I want to be in the world, and how does it fit in my life? If anybody isn't tracking, like, you're in a meeting and you have to decide if you're going to speak up about something or not, and it's risky. The who do I want to be question, what I guess I hear Ryan encouraging you to do is, what am I willing to get fired for?
Yeah.
And there should be some things. There should be some things that it's okay for me to speak up, even if I lose my job. And what I've experienced in my career is I've never been actually fired for doing it. Mm-hmm. But there are times when I have to be willing to be fired and speak up and get over, and not go to a certain meeting or call a certain meeting that's really uncomfortable, right? Because who do I want to be in the world, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good way of framing it. Like, what am I willing to stick my neck out for? And there are some things. I think that's going to vary by person, but hopefully we have some alignment on what that means. I don't know. I don't want to like go into sociology on this kind of stuff, but I think about this stuff a lot. I love it.
I think they would love it if you went into because part of what I found out about Ryan getting ready for this meeting is he's not just a computer nerd. So that you've already heard the neuroscience, you've already heard a little bit of. So go ahead, go into sociology. It's great.
All right. Well, I don't know. I read this book. It's not a sociology book. It's a philosophy book. It's called What We Owe the Future. And it's really, I mean, like I said at the beginning of this, like, all these things really are related in my mind. It's not just a company. It's part of the social fabric that we're creating. And I personally think there is no one way we can do it. There's none of this is deterministic, right? We're building the world we want to live in, just like we're building the software that our companies are going to use and our customers are going to use. The idea of social constructivism, like that we are really working together, mostly tacitly and in unstated ways, negotiating what it means to get breakfast at a place. We're making up the world that we want to live in. And thinking in the short term has been pretty destructive in lots of ways. I think those same lessons can apply at every level of life, whether it's your own personal level or your work, the company that you work in, to the broader sort of social context. Who you want to be in the world, and like standing on principle, having some direction and goal that's not just make a quick buck, or how do I get this one little feature out the door, or how do I raise the share price by into this quarter, or whatever. Those are not goals that lead to good things, in my opinion. So I don't know. That's, I guess, my little soapbox thing, I guess. But,
it wasn't that much sociology.
Yeah, it wasn't that much sociology. There's more like what
companies. I guess our companies are like an enterprise is one little a specific way people work together to do something in the world, to make a change, and whether it's to deliver a healthcare or whether it's to sell. There's an enterprise at the end of my road. Is this very, very enterprising guy with a truck that he just got a wrap on, and he sells tacos cash only, and it's an enterprise too, So yeah. People go out in the world to do something, and you only get to work with so many enterprises in your whole career, right? And so what role you play in those, you're contributing to something, right? And that's I wrote it down in the chat what you said. We're building the world we want to live in. Every day we go to work, we're putting our work into some particular thing. It's not. It matters what it is. It matters who we work for.
Yep, it does. It does. I think we tend to have like this cynical perspective. I know that's something I battle against a lot, and I just have a lot of sort of inherent cynicism about the world that we've created, and even just like my job sometimes, like just waking up and going to my job seems so, I don't know, pointless sometimes. But the way you just said that and is, I think, absolutely right. It matters what we choose to do with our days, because we're building the future in a sense.
And you chose to come on a Sunday to the MuleSoft Architect meetup. I questioned it a couple of times over the years because I don't know. Like, I've given a lot of my life to the MuleSoft brand that I don't have any shares of. So what am I doing that for? Yeah. Here I am in this. Why we're here on a Sunday, having this conversation about MuleSoft because we think it's worth having.
Yeah. Yep, that's right. And I mean, I have always kind of inherently, almost intuitively agreed with the idea of API-led connectivity. I don't particularly care if it's done over HTTP. They could be done with queues like Eric's going to talk about. You could hide those queues behind your interface or whatever. There's lots of ways you can go about it. You could use event streams, and
people do.
Yeah, people do, and it works. It can work really well, but it doesn't always work really well, right? And it's not because of the technology usually. It's usually because of the people side of the equation. Like, things break down, and so that's why I kind of tend to preach on this sort of stuff a lot of times, because it's like the idea is solid. There's very much a vision for a well-integrated company that MuleSoft's had their finger on for a long time. And it works sometimes. It works for companies that are willing to kind of invest in the relationships that make it work. But that doesn't always happen, right? A lot of times it's just, let's apply this patch to our company. Let's let MuleSoft fix it. And that doesn't work.
That won't work. That can't work.
No, it does not.
So I'm looking at our time. I'd like to do an item on our agenda people could walk away with, specifically as like homework assignments, but it's not school. But like, you've mentioned a bunch of books that you have read that you think people might get some value out of for the topics we talked about today, and maybe even some books that you're planning to read. You're a reader. It's obvious you're a reader. So maybe you could share your recommendations on library to just the community.
Okay, well, I think the books I've mentioned in this one were the one you brought up, John Cotter's Leading Change. That's a good sort of leadership book. That was on the Harvard Business Review leadership books. I think that came out in like 2014. That's definitely a good read, and that would give you some more depth of understanding for the whole idea of Catalyst. That's where a lot of those ideas sort of precipitated. The Software Architect Elevator, that's an excellent book. I appreciate his perspective. We've talked about that sort of elevator metaphor. I really appreciate his perspective because one of the things he emphasizes is, as an architect, we need to keep our technical skills up to date. We need to stay relevant and be able to communicate in those terms with our development teams. We can't just kind of go up into the ivory tower, because you lose insight and you lose credibility pretty quickly, I think, but then he's also saying we need to work on sort of our understanding of the business, and then also work on soft skills, learn how to communicate, learn how to listen. So there's a lot of that in there. That's a good book. I mentioned that book, What We Owe the Future. I just think it's a real simple sort of high level philosophy. Yeah, just having a longer term perspective for the good of the world that you want to create. What else?
We got a recommendation from the chat, actually. Marta recommended Bold. If you want to say, do you know that one, or Marta, do you want to tell us the author?
Let's check that out. How to Go Big, Create Wealth, and Impact the World. Let's see. That is.
I like the last one best. Impact the World. That's good.
Yeah, that's cool. Mm-hmm. Peter Diamandis and Stephen Kotler. Yeah. Interesting. I'll check that out.
Nice. And who was What We Owe the Future by?
Oh, that was McCaskill. That William McCaskill, I believe.
Yeah. I think we'll publish a reading list, and we'll send a follow-up email for the meetup. If Victoria and Stuti want to help me remember to do that, that would be very nice.
I think you would be on board with this idea too. I would say that every enterprise architect or any integration architect should read books on domain-driven design as much as possible.
Eric Evans, although there's a whole bunch on it now.
Yeah, that's a class we should build. How do we do that?
Yeah, that'd be good. Well, thank you, Ryan. I've used up our invitation. Our time is up. So I really appreciate you getting together, having this conversation. This has worked out amazingly. I think it's going to make great content. We'd love to have you back